Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our YouTube channel. Martin with me. Always a pleasure to meet with our CEO at Carbonetic, Mr. Brent Tolmie. Hi, Brent. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Martin, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Hopefully, it's not as hot where you live compared to where I am. We've been 7 days of at least 40 degrees ish, and I'm talking about Celsius. And apparently, the weather will be the same for another 7 to 10 days around here. So, might be a little bit fresher, where you are, closer to the coast.
Yeah, we definitely have that coastal influence. Typically highs of maybe high 20s, low 30s, cools off to about 15 degrees at night. So pretty pleasant weather,
Oh,
but obviously not great for the wildfire situation across the province. Lots of fires burning, lots of fires encroaching on our project areas. So, it's something that we enjoy the summer weather. We enjoy being out at the lake, enjoy hiking, but always cognizant of how dry it is in the woods.
yeah, and this is what we wanted to talk about today, right? So, first, given an update on what's going on in British Columbia regarding forest fires, there's a major fire which happened around Fort Nelson. For previously, for the people who maybe were not aware of, we had a forest fire in Fort Nelson a few weeks ago. It's still burning in some other areas, as we saw on the map of British Columbia. And I related the map on our LinkedIn channel as well, if the people wants to see under Carbonetic. But that fire is still going up northeast. And one other thing that we can talk about today, Brent, is the fact that related, to high temperatures, as it is close to 40 degrees right now here in Kelowna, BC. When you're in the forest, it feels a little bit more comfortable when you have shade. If you don't have shade, you have an issue, right? So, what can we say about these conditions that we are going through this summer?
Yeah, I think that it's a good point. Where there's shade, there's more recovery or at least preservation of moisture in the soil. And generally, how we gauge fire risk is by understanding, obviously, the climatic factors like wind, lack of moisture, dry conditions, high humidity, things like that, where there's a lack of moisture in general in the soil. And you can really feel that when you're in the forest and you're walking along and you can feel that it's dry. You can see that it's dry. You start to kick up dust. Whereas typically, when you're walking through a nice, lush second growth or old growth forest, there just won't be any dust. And in a lot of cases, there's still mud depending on where you're at. So we see that gradually start to disappear and it just gets drier. And then that correlates with what we see in terms of snowpack left this time of year. So there's mountains around here, Mount Baker just across the line in Washington State. It's a good example. It's always got snow on it. If we're out in the Rocky Mountains or perhaps some of the mountains around where Martin is, the Monachees, the Selkirks, there'll be peaks and glaciers and valleys that still retain snow year round. Where I live, Mount Shiam's a good bellwether. If there's snow going into August, then that's generally a sign that things are a little bit wetter, a little bit cooler. That's always a good thing. When Shiam's bare and you can just see rock, well, then you know it's going to be very, very dry. And we're already seeing a nearly bare Mount Shiam, just a few little pockets of snow in the shady areas. And you just see that when you're in the forest. You see that when you're walking around the park. You see that even in your city where there's just that lack of precipitation. But not only that, a lack of recovery in the morning, just very dry.
And this is also, you're talking about city. This is another concern, right? When we can, of course, talk about Canada because that's where we live. But since that they've been building a lot of housing all over the place, well, of course, sometimes it means that they have to remove trees or they have to remove bushes to build new houses or condo buildings or whatever commercial real estate. But at the end of the day, it adds on more concrete, more pavement, and increase the heat in the city that you live in because you get less and less of these green space, correct?
Yeah, yeah, it's a direct sort of correlation between how much heat there is, and I think the statistics is sometimes there's a swing of anywhere from 10 to 12 degrees in temperature. And you just see that. It's nice to live on streets that are lined with trees. And yes, trees are a pain because they drop leaves, they have sap, they attract birds that will crap on your cars. The flip side is you get a very hot, very non-green environment to live in, where you're just praying for these mature trees to hurry up and grow and bring some lack of temperature, bring some coolness, allow a spot for your dogs to rest and for people to play around and not be out in that direct sunlight, because we all get it. And I mean, the great example in the wilderness is when you're hiking and you come out of the tree line and you're just into the rock, you can just feel the heat bearing down on you. Even when you're at high elevation, we were hiking in the Rockies. One of the famous peaks around Canmore is Howling, and we went up to the saddle. As soon as you came out of the tree line, it was hot. Back into the tree line, it was nice and cool, and it was a very enjoyable hike. Same thing in cities. You get tree-lined boulevards, and they will be quite literally 10 to 12 degrees Celsius cooler than a lot of the contemporary places that are newer and just don't have that shade. So it is so important to have good urban forest practices because it can really soak up the heat. And it's something that we want to be aware of too in the forest, where leaving trees in place creates more shade, is better for habitats. Not to say there's no cutting of trees and whatnot, but it is important.
It is. So going back to the boreal forest, where our operations are occurring, what's going on? So we've been, let's say, as a perfect analogy, let's touch wood, huh, Brent? So far, it's been a good fire season. What I mean by that is that it's been way less difficult than what we had last year. The forest fires at this time of the year was absolutely brutal back in BC last year. This year, it's been a little bit better, but we are still having, to look into what's going on around our projects, but because there's still fire burning up North BC, correct?
Yep. Yeah, totally correct. And even in our project area, there's a few small fires going. And if you were to go to the fire map of British Columbia, you would see that there's a concentration of fires in the Northeast. And I think I want to jump back to something you said. Fort Nelson's close to where we're working with Casca in the north of BC, same general area, a little bit south. And that fire was not only a holdover fire from last year that we talked about earlier, how the zombie fires risk got kicked up, and this is the real evidence of it. But the fire that actually caused the evacuation of Fort Nelson was actually caused by a tree hitting a power line. And of course, when trees hit the power line, it arcs over, causes a fire. And that was the fire that actually damaged properties, burned down houses, and caused the whole entire township of Fort Nelson to be evacuated for weeks. You just think about the economic repercussions, not only the loss of housing, but the loss of economy in a small town where, they've really struggled to recover because of the lack of forest economy up there and sort of the mismanagement of resources. And it struck with me that something as simple as forest management along that power line corridor would have actually prevented that fire. And that's why we're so passionate about forest management. It's about recognizing that we're not going to leave all trees in place, but that we can build resilience to avoid some of these fires that shouldn't have occurred. And if we could remove those risks, we can have a better outcome. And I was thinking about that as I was driving back home from Canmore, Alberta, where we were hiking in the mountains. And we drive through a place where there was a tremendous wildfire last year in the town of Chase that burned right through some of the indigenous communities, and particularly on a stretch of Highway 1, the main highway through Canada, between Big and Little Shuswap Lake. So Chase is on the Little Shuswap side, Sicamous Salmon Arm, Sorrento is on the other side, Big Shuswap Lake, and it's connected by the Shuswap River. So as you're driving through, well, what do you see? You see this tremendous burn. What do you also see? New power lines strung through what? through trees that have been burnt, and at any point in time could be caused to fall on new power line. Now we got the same thing again. And so I'm looking at the lunacy of this, and I'm sure some of those trees have been inspected by qualified danger tree assessors, but these are burned, damaged, dying trees adjacent to another power line. And I'm like, this is, again, just goes back to the management. How easy would it be for danger tree followers to come and build a corridor? And I know we were here on one side of the conversation, we're saying we want to plant more trees in cities to develop shade. But on the other side, we have this interface of what humans need to exist: highways, roads, power lines, natural gas lines, oil pipelines, all this infrastructure, train tracks that we need to support our lives. And yet the flip side is we're not even managing those corridors effectively. So now I'm just waiting for another fire to rip through that area. And yeah, there will be less fuel because there's already been a fire. But let's not take for granted that doesn't mean a fire can't burn through there again. And the same risk that caused the issue in Fort Nelson could be again seen, in the Shuswap area. And then I started thinking about it. Well, that's exactly what caused the chaotic and massively expensive wildfires in the Shasta area of California, and what nearly bankrupted, or did in some way bankrupt, PG&E, the utility.
Yeah.
And it was all due to mismanagement of a resource corridor. And I'm like, we have the ability to see this high risk and remove it, but there just seems to be an unwillingness to deal with that. And I think so that's why carbon projects are good, because it takes that decision-making power out of an agency that's very disconnected and doesn't understand what's actually going to occur or could occur. And it puts it in the hands of people like us, like our Indigenous partners, that can say, you know what, those trees have got to go. We've got to build a resilient corridor. We can't have that threat anymore. We can eliminate it once and for good. It's not a huge impact to the carbon budget. We just get rid of that risk.
Yeah, it seems like it's always the same kind of play, Brent, to me, right? It's millions and millions of dollars are invested, to build the infrastructure. But by the time the infrastructure is in place, there is minimal or basically no money which has been provided to maintain the infrastructures, or just to make sure. So if I'm not mistaken, and you might have to refresh my memory on this one, but the chase fire that you were mentioning, was it not actually potentially a train which created a spark on a track, and the bushes which was around the track started blazing or something like that? Because that's part of another risk, right? Which is related to, well, it's not just having a track, but we should also make sure that there is no brush around it if we have a fire hazard potential.
Yeah, that I think that was generally associated with the Lytton fire.
Okay.
And there was a lawsuit, and it seems to be a little bit nebulous as to who is responsible.
Yeah.
One thing I'll tell you is that Lytton is typically the hotspot of Canada, and the main line for the railway passes right through that community. And it was torched. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been committed to rebuild that community. Very little of that has occurred. So it's a real issue. And whether or not the fire came from the rail line, if you stand there on a hot day and you watch the sparks come off the metal wheels and the metal tracks, you would say that it's probably a strong likelihood that could have occurred. And again, we're not here to judge what did happen.
No.
We're here to point out that there is a mismanagement of infrastructure and making sure that it is resilient to wildfire. And here's the thing, is that carbon projects work really well because we take those responsibilities on, because we know that a wildfire can cause far and away more damage than the extraction of commercial logging. We take a typical wildfire, and I'm just looking, in our project area, or one of our areas, we have some wildfires burning out of control. And if we look at the size of them, 166 hectares. So that doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about a province of 65 million hectares of trees. It's a rounding error. But commercial harvest is probably, when we talk about our plan and how we develop our carbon credits, we're probably only talking about 1,000 or 2,000 hectares a year of impact from commercial deforestation. And so that is really the challenge. And then we have one little wildfire, and in a month or in a day or in a week, we wipe out 166 hectares, and that's a small fire. So if we can move the needle a very small amount in wildfire, then we can have a really lasting effect on these projects. And we want to admit that we won't be able to capture or stop all wildfire, that lightning strikes occur, that human interface, as much as we want to remove that risk as possible, we can't get it to zero. And that's okay. But what we really need to acknowledge is the fact that we can make a difference. And if we had local decision making, local eyeballs, local sensing technologies, and the ability to really quickly deploy a crew to keep that 1 hectare fire a 1 hectare fire, to get our smoke jumpers out there, to get helicopter resources that are in the community, that are owned by the community, and that stay in the community, that will make the difference. If there's a wildfire going on the Alaska Highway, that Casca can immediately deploy resources down there because they're there, instead of phoning a line that's staffed in Kamloops or Prince George or Victoria, and then having a response sent, and then them deciding, okay, well, we better go look at it. So them arranging air transportation either through Watson Lake, Yukon, or maybe Fort Nelson, and then getting a plane in the air and then going and looking at it and deciding, well, I wonder what we should do. And then trying to find resources to get up there to action that fire, perhaps admitting that they don't have the budget to do it. And that's a remote part of the world, so we're just going to let it burn. These are all unacceptable bottlenecks in just addressing the problem. And that's why we believe that these projects have to be coupled with the local ownership and the local community, and we can prevent a whole lot of fires from occurring, or at least keep them in check.
Yeah, and there's a big difference in commitment when you are close to the problem as a community, right? You're willing to gather all forces, having the people in place that you can actually try to solve the issue. When trying to solve the issue when you're 5,000 kilometers away and you don't feel the same impact on your economy and on your way, actually, to build your own personal growth. It reminds me, just to end on that note, Brent, same thing happened, as 21 years ago, we had a fire in Kelowna. And at the time, if I'm not mistaken, because I was not living in BC at the time, but back in those years, it's been known to be one of the worst fire we had around actually a living community in British Columbia. And so, of course, they had investigation going after the fire. They came with some different kind of results and what should be improved. And what's the result? Well, last year, 20 years later, we had a massive fire, as you know, on the west side. And absolutely nothing of what has been suggested 20 years ago has been put in place actually to change the perspective, or trying actually to change the perspective on what happened. So we're just going on and on and on with the same problems, having a discussion on the moment because now it's going through the media, but there is no real commitment, to make things change, where the private industry, the private sector, like companies like ours, can make the difference when we are boots on the ground.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's decoupling the decision-making process. And again, I'll harp on this. Our provincial capital is on an island, and on the very southern tip of the island below the 49th parallel. And there's a very small chance of a wildfire ever impacting the quality of life in Victoria, where our politicians live and work and where the bureaucracy exists. And so they don't get the smoke that the Okanagan gets, where it's nicknamed Smokanagan in the summer, and people will actually stop visiting that area because of the smoke. They don't experience the haze that we get in the Fraser Valley before the wind comes in from the ocean and pushes the haze up over the mountains due to wildfire coming from different directions. They don't live with that risk, and certainly our friends in the Northeast have that issue ongoing. So there's large chunks of the province that experience smoke and that quality of life impact, as well as air quality and the health implications. They're just so disconnected, and it's hard to believe that there is a real and present threat when you could not find a place further, 2 points further away than Victoria and Fort Nelson, for instance. They're just so decoupled from it. And it's nice when the politicians want to talk about the changes that they're enacting. And we're a fan of the things that are being added in terms of the budget to wildfire and the ongoing recruiting. What we're hearing is that there's already fatigue, and we're just in early July, that they're trying to recruit anyone that can get their hands on to go fight wildfires. This is a real issue, and it's just not being addressed. So I completely agree. It needs to go out of the hands of people who are disconnected from the land and back into the rightful landholders. And fortunately, we have this thing called carbon finance, the sale of carbon offsets, that can actually generate the revenues needed to keep these things at a minimum.
Well, thanks again, Brent, for the great explanation. As usual, for all of our viewers, we'll keep you in the loop through the holidays this summer. As much as it's pretty hot where we live, I think it's pretty hot everywhere in Canada at the time we speak. But one thing for sure is that we keep on fighting actually what's going on in the forest. We want to improve it. We want to work with our Indigenous partners who can make a difference in the boreal forest of Canada. So thanks again, Brent. See you next week for the next video. And well, enjoy the rest of the week.
Always a pleasure.